Good afternoon. My name is Mārtiņš Vargulis and I am researcher at Latvian Institute of International Affairs. I'm delighted to be the moderator of the next episode of the podcast series of the Riga Security Forum. Traditionally, Riga Security Forum is taking place in Riga in autumn and in place. But this year has been different. This year has changed a lot. Nevertheless, we are pleased to provide the hybrid model a platform for the thought-provoking discussions on several topical issues. And this particular episode will be devoted to the challenges that we are facing near abroad. We will devote our discussion on Belarus, indicating and analyzing what kind of long-term challenges we have for not only the region, but also for the wider transatlantic community. And in order to answer to those questions, I'm delighted to have a panel of distinguished experts and professionals, and I would like to introduce them. First, Mr. Valdis Zatlers, who is former President of the Republic of Latvia. Mr. President, hopefully you hear us loud and clear.
All are welcomed.
Next, two international representatives, one from Poland, Mr. Marcin Przydacz, who is Undersecretary of State for Security, the America, Asia and Eastern Policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Przydacz, it's a pleasure to have you here today, and hopefully you hear us loud and clear as well.
Yes, perfectly. Thank you for having me here.
And last but not least, our friend and ally, Mr. Arkady Moshes, who is Program Director of the EU Eastern Neighbourhood and Russia Research Program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Moshes, it's a pleasure to have you here and to hear your thoughts and insights on the region and particularly Belarus.
Very good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today online. Mr. President, I would like to start the discussion with you to kick off the discussion, and we would like to have your perspective on the broader terms. What's going on in the Belarus? What are the internal prospects? What have caused what's happening in Belarus? What's your reading? What's your take? What Belarusian summer and autumn is about?
It's a very good question, not so easy to be answered. So what's going in Belarus today? That's the most important question. And when we had the previous discussion about Belarus, some of us really said that Lukashenko will survive. But the question is for how long time? And if we see the winter approaching, the protesters, get a little bit tired. They get a little bit much more cold, exposed to cold, and they need to change the tactics. They really need to change the tactics because otherwise, the same situation is going on. It's favorable for Lukashenko because he's satisfied. He gains the time for some actions inside his power team. And of course, the violence is increasing. And of course, if you look at the news during the last days, the use of force in Berlin, plays into the hands of Lukashenko, saying, I am not alone, people in democratic world do the same. But basically, what I see as a change is if the opposition changes their tactics. Because what is really surprised to me that they catch the leaders, they put them in the jail, they torture them and they beat them, but still every Sunday new leaders are coming up. And this is a positive note, because this is a question of the consciousness of the people themselves. And with each Sunday, they learn how to self-organize and how to really change the tactics and how to communicate between each other. But let's say, as we said in the previous time, if nothing changes in the tactics of opposition, Lukashenko is going to be the president for some longer time that we all expect.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to elaborate on what you already said, and would highly appreciate if Mr. Przydacz could take this one. Mr. Przydacz, how do you perceive what we are witnessing in the Belarus? Is the change inevitable, or we are observing something that will completely change the way Belarus is developing further?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much once again for having me here in this very important and timely discussion, and especially with the presence of such a distinguished panelist. I do really appreciate that Latvia is also involved partner in discussion of the current situation in Belarus, since we are both neighbors of this country, and we are both interested in the developments of this country. I would say let's be realistic. Definitely, Mr. Lukashenko won't hesitate, even if it costs lives, as we've witnessed last week. He's played all in, and the question is what comes next, and more violence or more persecution, possibly, unfortunately, more victims, as every fading dictator. He's determined to keep the power until the very end, and Moscow's temporary guarantee makes him feel even more confident. That's on one hand. On the other hand, we observe the awakening of the society of the Belarusian nation, and this process, I would say, won't stop. And what's more, this brutal persecution may only beef it up. For the time being, Lukashenko may force people to stop participating in demonstrations out of fear they may lose health, or even with a risk of losing their life. But this will be a Pyrrhic victory of Mr. Lukashenko. It may take time. Time, but I would say, and that's my personal opinion, that the society will win, and I agree with Mr. President. Sooner or later, there will be a kind of change in Belarus. The more brutal Lukashenko is, the shorter time it takes. In Poland, as we remember from the history, it took us 10 years since the creation of the solidarity movement until the round table, which ended the communist rule in my country. And I believe that the Belarusian is even much closer to the end goal. So we have a new actor, we have a new nation of Belarus, and sooner or later there will be change. The only question is when and it will be, and how long Russia will support Mr. Lukashenko, because I'm pretty sure that they know that it's a costly exercise. I mean, supporting Lukashenko against the nation of Belarus makes Russia to pay some costs. And of course, they cannot let to be the change of power because only of the protest, but the days or the weeks or the months of Mr. Lukashenko, I would say, are unnumbered. We just need to wait for the developments.
Thank you, Mr. Przydacz, and now to Mr. Moshes. Taking into account what already has been said, what's your reading? Do you believe that we are experiencing the end of the Lukashenko era in one time, or sooner or later? Or you still believe that he will manage to control the power vertical, to control the regime, to stabilize and dismiss the protests? What's your reading on that?
A minute ago, you asked if the change is inevitable. I will go further and say that the change has already happened. And it did not happen in August. It happened much earlier. About a year and a half, together with a colleague, we co-authored a paper called Belarusian Paradox: the country of today versus a president of the past. The gap between a fairly modern and further quickly modernizing society, an absolutely archaic, anachronistic president with his attitudes to life, to processes in the society, to the economy, to the modern world. I mean, this gap has gotten so wide that eruption was inevitable. I was not predicting it to happen just after these presidential elections. And it happened because of a series of very clear and very specific mistakes that the regime had done during the run-up to the elections. But it was to happen sooner rather than later. So I agree with both previous speakers that strategically this regime is on its way out. However, saying that, I would not be too quick in my predictions. Lukashenko is back in the saddle. He was, and his regime was shaken a little bit between, let's say, roughly the 10th and the 20th or 25th of August. But after that, it demonstrated its ability still to stand up and to fight. And an important thing to understand is that this regime can make mistakes, but it doesn't panic. And when it takes a decision which is wrong, which is counter-effective from the point of view of the regime's goals, it can redecide and re-implement. And what matters is that the power vertical follows the orders. Russia is a key factor indeed. And it's not even the economic side of the matter. It's the message that is sent to the power vertical. The message is that we will stand by Lukashenko, so you, the bureaucrats, the representatives of the power structures, you have no other side to defect, because we will be working with Lukashenko and with nobody else. And again, that's why we might come back to that later. I've always been and still remain skeptical when I'm reading or hearing the comments that Russia is deciding to do this or that. It's preparing for the replacement. It's preparing how it's going to play after the constitution is changed. It might all be happening. But now the main message that is coming from Russia is that it's going to continue supporting Lukashenko diplomatically, economically, and if need be, through providing him with power structures, whether it likes it or not. But that's another story. It might not like it, but it supports Lukashenko and chooses Lukashenko. And his chances to continue this game for a certain period of time are quite substantial, I would say. Unless indeed the tactics of the protesters change, unless the protesters develop the understanding of what they stand for, rather than just what they stand against, and change the behavior on the streets as well.
Thank you, Mr. Moshes. And immediate follow-up to you. I understand that speculations and attempts to provide any kind of scenarios is not a favorable thing for the international expert, but nevertheless, what's your prediction? How will the next 2 years develop in Belarus? And what are the key elements that could change in one or another way?
Yes, making predictions is always difficult. One key thing to watch is the economy. The situation in the Belarusian economy is worsening quite quickly, and Russia's willingness to cover the difference, to give Lukashenko as much money as he might potentially need, is certainly not there. So the possibility for the destabilization, for economic reasons, for further destabilization is quite serious. And that might fasten the process quite significantly. The second factor is the ability of the opposition, which I've mentioned, to come up with a clear idea of what they want to do and to show that they are united, because unfortunately they have not been convincing very much, because I mean the different representatives of the opposition living in different European cities say, well, not totally contradictory things, but certainly they create not the impression they need to create, and they're not able to bring it back to the people. And three, it will depend on the position of the West, which again, especially European Union in this regard, which we will talk about that later, but it has been totally unconvincing to me. I mean, not that the things that the EU did were totally wrong, they were generally right, but they came with such a delay, which basically nullified most of their significance. If all three factors continue developing in the way beneficial for the protesters, the regime will go sooner. But my predictions have been, starting from August, that probably it will still take 2 to 3 years before the regime falls, if it falls.
Thank you, Mr. Moshes. And back to Mr. Przydacz. What's your reading? What kind of transition of power we can expect? Do you believe that Lukashenko will stay at power, or do you believe that the protests will go on and completely change the system in a way Belarus is developing further?
Well, at this very moment, we don't know what the scenario will be and how long Russia, who has the key actually to the current situation in Belarus, what Russia will do. Definitely, as I said before, they are not very happy with the current developments in Belarus, since we have to also remember that Belarusians, they were mostly pro-Russian society, and now they're asking themselves why we are pro-Russian, why we are so unfavorable for Kremlin, if Kremlin is supporting constantly the authoritarian regime, if Kremlin is supporting the guy who is beating us on a street, if Kremlin does not help us in the not only political but economical crisis, as our expert just said. We have to remember it, that this political crisis is deeply rooted in the economical one. A lot of people, a number of people are on the street because of the worsening socio-economic situation in their own country. So, of course, the key are in Moscow, but also in other European countries, especially neighboring countries. We are asking, or we are trying to invite Mr. Lukashenko to start a dialogue not only with us, but especially with their own society, with the opposition, with those leaders who are in Vilnius, in Warsaw, but also those who are still in Belarus. The dialogue is the only and the proper way to the way out of this crisis. The changes of the constitution proposed by authorities in Minsk, or apparently from Moscow, without the involvement of the people, won't change anything. I mean, people they are grown up enough, I mean, to be a partner in this discussion. The sooner authorities in Minsk will understand it, the better for them, because I won't predict that Mr. Lukashenko would understand it. I mean, he's over. I mean, he shouldn't be a subject of this of the discussion about the future, because people in Belarus, they just don't accept him. And so, as we, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe other European countries, we should keep our pressure both on Minsk and Moscow to start a dialogue, to think about the future of this country, because what's the scenario for the next couple of months? As I agree with the other partners in this panel, Mr. Lukashenko is somehow selling elements of the sovereignty of his country and his nation for keeping him in the office. I mean, for keeping him in Minsk, giving some elements of the economically in a area of security, etc., just for the support. So it's very dangerous situation for the sovereignty of the country of Belarus, and we as neighboring country, we are especially, I mean, we're strictly for the sovereign, free independent Belarus. That should be a partner for us, and any kind of outcome of this dialogue should guarantee that this country will be independent, sovereign, and that there will be the dialogue between the authorities and the society.
Thank you, Mr. Przydacz. I would like to have discussion on European Union approach at the end of our conversation, and now speak a bit more about the big elephant in the room, meaning Russia. Mr. President, what's your take on what Mr. Putin is calculating? What's on the agenda? How could he react in Belarus in the upcoming months and probably years? What's your take on that?
You see, European Union has an interest to have Belarus as a democratic country, as a part of Europe. Russia has just an opposite interest, to have Belarus at least very close to Russia or even integrated into Russia. So, and this is why the tools are different. What are the Russia interests? Military union, political union, economic union, and Russia says that there is a crisis in Belarus. And one of the principles of tackling the crisis is to gain time and to reduce the stakes. That means gaining time, Russia can really apply different tools for getting Belarus closer to Russia. If we talk about the military annexation, it's not the case in the nearest future, but possibly may happen when the things go really wrong, as we saw in Karabakh conflict. It's much more like a Crimea approach, gradual penetrating in the vertical of power. That means that penetrating in media, penetrating in security forces and police, and I think, and maybe I guess only, but it's already happening. That's how what was mentioned before, you know, Lukashenko trades out Belarusian sovereignty. So this gradual creeping penetration may lead to much closer integration of Belarus into Russia. So, and what we can do, you see, the only it's an obstacle that works against these tactics, gaining time, is that the economy is getting worse. More you keep the time, and the economy is getting worse. And the Belarusians must understand that any scenario, becoming a European-type democratic state, keeping the status quo, or more integration with Russia will cost them, every family, economic pain. This will be a very, very hard process. So there's no scenario that the Belarusians go through then without any economic difficulties. So the choice is what you get afterwards. And that's the Belarusian choices. Okay, I am as a democratic man, I would prefer a democratic state because I know why I'm suffering economic difficulties. Because the end result will be much, much happier for me and for my family and for my nation. I don't think that the Russia's approach is similar. Russia has definite military, political interests. And I say it again, look at Crimea as an example, creeping annexation without any shot. Any bullet was shot out. But in Karabakh, you know, when the real situation de facto, then nobody could interfere, the military presence was immediately implemented. So, not too much happy scenarios, you know, at least as the next coming year.
So not optimistic view. Mr. Moshes, what's your reading? Belarus is different from, of course, from Ukraine and other Eastern neighborhood countries, all 6 of them. Is there a possibility for Belarus, if I may put so, to become a next frozen conflict if the protest continues, the support for the right rises, so on and so forth? What's your take on that?
I don't think there will be a frozen conflict. There will be solution, better or or worse, that's a definitely other question, but there will be a solution. No conflict will be frozen in Belarus. The moment is we have to discuss what the West and the European Union can help. Because if you offer, let's say, your help without demand, it always fails. So it's really, we have to understand that sanctions are long run effect. It will not, implement the effect immediately, or let's say in a month or two, even in 3. It's a long-term tool. So we have to find another tool. And really, if the power elite of Belarus is in danger, they don't care about the sanctions. They don't need to travel anymore, except if something they lose some money or lose their businesses.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Moshes, do you have the same reading on this? Do you agree with Mr. President on?
There will be no frozen conflict in Belarus. I mean, the situation is completely different. The protests are not geopolitical, and you cannot really sell them inside Russia as being anti-Russian. And that's a precondition for using force of scale. The situation is just completely different. But if I may, I would like to actually go back to the Russia question, because I think I have something to contribute, and this is something maybe non-traditional. Because I argue that Kremlin is actually having huge problems with its Belarus policy at the moment. Having preferred the incumbency of Lukashenko to the possibility, to the chance to reset the relations with the people of Belarus, it lost. Not only regarding the people, but because it just went back to the problems that it has not been able to solve for decades. So what is the dilemma that the Kremlin is facing? You cannot replace Lukashenko. I'm sorry. I mean, it's not over time, yes, possibly, but overnight you can't. The system is so personalistic that if you deliberately cut the head of the system, the body dies. You cannot put a new head onto this personalistic system, because you will get infighting between the clans within the power vertical. They will not deliver. And any new person will be listening to his friends, to the elites, and to the people, because whatever you say, people will interpret the departure of Lukashenko after the protests as his departure as a result of the protests. And you will get politics in Belarus, which it hasn't been having them for decades. And you will get a person who will think about double loyalty, one loyalty to Moscow, but the other loyalty, normal political system of alliances, which this new person would need to be building inside the country. So this whole system would have a good chance to collapse. So replacing Lukashenko is not really a choice for Moscow at the moment, because they would get a totally unpredictable situation instead of an autocrat, which they do not necessarily like, but kind of they know and understand his instincts. But dealing with Lukashenko is also problematic, because imagine Lukashenko is weak. Imagine he starts signing all these roadmaps and giving the Russians control over the economic assets and allowing them to have military bases and all that. What this is going to do? It is going to provoke a new wave of protests, this time a geopolitical revolution. This time people finally starting waving EU and NATO flags. You would need to respond by maybe an intervention, which is, as I said, will not be popular. So it's difficult. I mean, a weak Lukashenko, if you really use his weakness, will provoke the crisis rather than prevent the crisis. And a strong Lukashenko, or even strengthening Lukashenko, is an old, well-known Lukashenko. It's the guy who will not deliver, who will take the money but not do final political concessions. I agree that he's been actually solving and trading off the sovereignty. I've been writing about that for years, being in clear polemics with most analysts in Europe who were saying that Lukashenko is the person who is protecting sovereignty in Belarus by protecting his own power. I was arguing that this is not the case, because over time Belarus is becoming structurally more dependent on Russia in terms of security, in terms of economy, in terms of soft power and all that. But this is the story that kind of has been going on. So you cannot replace Lukashenko. You cannot like the situation. You cannot exploit the situation when he is weak. and you cannot gain when he is strong. So if you're Kremlin, you're really in trouble. You really have to be thinking about, yes, how to penetrate. I fully agree. How to use new possibilities, but meanwhile you keep subsidizing the regime. This is a kind of a vicious circle which Kremlin has not been able to leave thus far, and it's clearly at a loss about how to go around this time.
Thank you. Mr. Przydacz, taking into account that Russia is playing a certain and particular role in Belarus, from your perspective, from your country's perspective, how that affects the relationship between Russia and Poland, and in the wider context, how does it affect the relationship between Russia and the West?
Well, you know, the relations between Russia and the West are not very easy, since we are, I mean, our countries and our communities are based on a totally different values and totally different foundations, I would say, and we are interested in the different goals, I mean, to achieve. I mean, the cooperation, the economic cooperation of the West is contradicted by the will of domination, especially with the military threats by Russia. So there is the deeply kind of constant misunderstanding between the Europe and the Russia, and I believe that the current situation in Belarus will be another ringing bell for the Westerners. What the real goal of Russia is to rebuild the Soviet architecture. That's what Mr. Putin a couple of years ago said. I mean, that the end of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And what's the outcome of this sentence? I mean, what's the result? He's trying to rebuild the position of Moscow as it used to be in the last century, while Europe is not interested, I would say, in that kind of scenario. That's why we have the Eastern Partnership Program. I mean, to have closer and closer those partners from the post-Soviet area, and the societies of those countries. They are not willing to be under domination of Russia either. I mean, in every single country of this 6 Eastern Partnership countries, we have a kind of instability. Mostly there are frozen conflicts, as we all agree. The Belarus was the last quite stable country. There is instability there. Again, I mean, in Belarus, because the people of Belarus, they just want to live in a different country. They just want to be ruled by different authorities. So I would say that this disagreement between the West and the Moscow is deeply in the kind of DNA of both civilizations, even. Nevertheless, we need to find a way how to keep the dialogue with Russia, how to solve some issues. But I would say that EU is the senior partner. EU is the bigger partner in this. It's the Russia that needs better cooperation with the EU. It's the EU with the money, it's the EU with the market, etc., etc. So we, whatever this dialogue will be, it should be based on our rules, on these 5 principles, but not like a la carte, like the menu in a restaurant, just to pick up the selective engagement and not maybe discussing about other issues like our values or human rights. Let's just see what's the human right condition in Russia right at this very moment, after Navalny, after Dmitriev, what's happening down there. So and we have a new factor. We have a new president of the United States in January. It may also change a bit the current status of the transatlantic cooperation, and also the relations with Russia. So, but I believe that there will be kind of continuation with Biden's administration. He understands what role Russia is playing and what's the goal of Mr. Putin, and that the values we are based on are completely different in both countries.
Thank you. Mr. Moshes, you already touched upon the EU's approach, and I know that you have been skeptical about EU's common approach towards Belarus. From your perspective, what are the main arguments why we as a Western community, European Union, have failed in, if I say so, in Belarus?
That's a big question. I could deliver a 3-hour lecture on that.
The short version.
Yes, I would start. So, I mean, I don't want to go really back into history and tell you what went wrong in the 90s, in 2000s, and so on. I'll still concentrate on the situation where we are now. I have been arguing, starting from 2014, that the reset of relations with Lukashenko on Lukashenko's terms was a mistake. The West, starting with the EU, should have had no illusions as to whether or not this regime was going to change. There was a reset that ended in 2006. There was a reset that ended in 2010 with a brutal repressions against the then protesters. So there was very little to hope that it would be different this time. Frankly, Einstein once said that one of the definitions of schizophrenia is doing the same thing every time, expecting a different result. So this was a mistake, because EU allowed Lukashenko to do practically everything Lukashenko wanted to do in his domestic policy. During the protests of 2017, socio-economic protests, which were also brutally oppressed, if I'm not mistaken, the European Union, namely High Representative Mogherini, once expressed concerns. That was not the reaction that people expected. So what I would do now if I were the EU, I would first of all look back seriously at the experience of the last 6 years and publicly admit that a mistake has been made, that a reset of relationship with Lukashenko regime on his terms, driven by some wishful thinking as concerns his foreign policy position, was a mistake. And that was a mistake which deprived the EU in particular of a fairly significant pro-European strata in the population that had existed there before 2010. It's not accidental that in 2010 protesters were waving EU flags, and this time they're completely indifferent to that. So this kind of lessons learned would not only need to be done. Maybe some people responsible for the launch of this policy should simply resign to show that the mistake is admitted. I know it's difficult, but that's why I'm not in the civil service. I'm not a politician, and I'm not a bureaucrat either. I can afford saying these things. But this would make an impact if people who were advocating this policy up until the bitter end, who were buying all Lukashenko's fairy tales about his difficult relationship with Russia and kind of basing their policy upon those fairy tales, these people should somehow demonstrate political responsibility. I understand that the EU is not a political organization, but it plays geopolitical games, and therefore it should demonstrate the readiness to accept political responsibility. Second, EU is not doing enough. This is absolutely incomprehensible. Why in 2010 150 people were put on the sanctions lists when the level of repressions was just simply incomparable with what we are seeing now. And now kind of we're still having 50 people, and we are still hearing the talk all the time about the need to have a dialogue with the regime. EU does not recognize Lukashenko as president, as an elected president. But I'm sorry, I don't see clarity, with the exception of certain countries where the ambassadors stay. Have they been recalled? Have they just traveled back out of demonstration of some solidarity, or quietly traveled back to their capitals without making even statements? De facto, nothing has changed. And that's why I'm saying that the EU is not doing enough. And what it is actually doing, it's doing so late. I cannot understand why it took 2 months to come up with the first 40 people who were put on the sanction list. I simply cannot understand it. When thousands, by now almost 20,000 Belarusians have gone through the jails, through human rights abuse, torturing, beating, humiliation, rape. Well, I'm sorry, the reaction is simply not what it should be. I am not necessarily advocating the economic sanctions. I'm not, because I'm hesitant to advocate serious economic sanctions to be imposed on the country in general. That might be counterproductive. But I am in favor of colossally increasing the amount of personal sanctions. And it's not totally true. The ministers they can't stay without traveling. They will get what they want. It will be brought to them. But let's say the rank and file police officers and their families have developed a habit of going to Białystok or Vilnius to buy their daily stuff over the recent years. And they should know that if their husbands continue behaving as they're behaving, there will be a price tag for these families as well. Again, I know that this is not okay with the human rights people. They say that only the persons directly responsible should be punished. I can accept that, but in that situation, at least people working in certain organizations and used for doing certain kind of functions should be massively put on sanctions list. The human rights organizations in Belarus have these lists. They have suspicions at least, and they have not only suspicions but proofs. So this list has to go up exponentially. After every meeting, it should expand. And we will see if there will be a result. I'm certain that there will be a result.
Thank you for this realistic and pragmatic approach and how you described what's going on and what EU didn't do in the respect to the Belarus. Mr. President, taking into account this realistic approach and lessons learned that we have already identified, looking forward, what should EU do with the Belarus?
You see, I'm not an active advocate of sanctions because they work in a long run. We need something that is immediately implemented and has an impact on Belarusian, let's say, political system. We were talking about the partnership for peace. That was a late initiative by NATO. We were talking about the Eastern Partnership and all that. It was very difficult because we tried to offer something which there was no demand on the opposite side. At present, we have to understand that the EU must keep the door open. Russia will do everything to shut the door. The borders are already shut, by the way. But we really have to investigate what possible needs the Belarusian society will need in the nearest future. Because one of the mistakes was, the late delivery. If they ask for some assistance today, we must deliver tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow. Therefore, it's very important that what will be and might be the demands, it's the assistance in institution building, including NGOs. So we have to really, all the people who live in our countries or stay in our countries, we have to assist them with the skills, with the knowledge how to do that. When there is another demand, even economic assistance, we should deliver next day. Because the problem of the Western democratic societies, especially EU, that the people in the third world, which are used to the decisions of the dictators, they can't understand. That needs some time to have consensus how we are going to deliver different assistance to Belarus. So we have to be prepared. We have to prepare ourselves to any change, which is any very small change, which will happen in the nearest future in Belarus. Do we have another tools? I totally agree that we have to put all these, let's say, police people and security people on blacklists. That's true. That's easy because this is definite violence. If there's a good argument, we put them on the backlist and don't wait. Let's put them immediately in the neighboring countries, and the EU will follow. So we have to do something more actively. But I will emphasize at the end, we should deliver immediately when the demand comes.
Thank you. Mr. Przydacz, if I may, I would like to a little bit complicate the last question to you. What should we from the region, I mean Baltic states and Poland, should do in this respect, and how you will describe what's next European Union neighborhood policy should be and should look like?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the responsibility is ours because we are the neighboring country. So every European country is also waiting for our position, and that's why we are in a close cooperation with our friends in Vilnius and in Riga, trying to coordinate also our policies. I would say that there is a kind of twofold approach needed. I mean, first, restrictive measures towards those responsible for those atrocities, as Arkady mentioned. The list is too short for sure. I mean, we as a neighboring country, we were advocating for the quicker response and for the longer blacklist. Unfortunately, EU works like this that need to be agreed among all 27 countries. But step by step, first there was a list of 40 names, then another tranche, another. So finally, I truly believe that we will reach the proper number of those responsible for first rigging the election, then using the force, torturing, raping, etc. All those atrocities mentioned by in this panel. So sanctioning people. I'm not advocating neither economic sanctions because that would negatively affect the ordinary people of Belarus, but there is another way of sanctioning those people responsible for the current developments in Belarus, is the targeted individual economic sanctions. I mean, put on those business entities who are in a close circle of Mr. Lukashenko, who are supporting the regime. And I would say that that's the proper way of the answer from the EU, and that should be the proposal of the neighboring country. That's because, I mean, we will lose definitely, since we are a neighboring country and the trade goes through our territories, also through Belarus. But anyway, we could pay this price. Those people who are financing the regime should also feel the answer from the EU side. That's the, let me say, the restrictive measures. The other is the positive scenario, the positive step. First is the economic plan for the new democratic Belarus, already proposed by Poland, backed by V4 countries and also backed by Baltic states, just to give a kind of political and economical positive scenario for the future Belarus, that there is something waiting for them. If they would succeed in changing the situation into the democratic system, there should be immediately the positive economic answer from the West, both EU but the transatlantic community. I mean, with the stabilization fund, with some cheap loans and financial support, investments into infrastructure, etc. That there is something waiting for them. We have much more offer to them than the Russian neighbor. They are mostly concentrating on threatening the people. We are concentrating on giving the positive scenario. So that's the one of the positive element in this scenario. The other one should be the positive answer and the help to those who were under repressions, those who had to flee the country, who left the country, who were expelled from universities, who lost their jobs. We in Poland already offered a special program, Solidarity with Belarus. The amount of money was around 50 million zlotys, so another 12 million of euros, supporting those people, supporting the free media, supporting the NGOs, I mean civil society activists. We believe that the other European countries, even richer than us, should follow this path. If we want to be a reasonable partner, if we want to be credible partner, we cannot close our eyes to this situation. I mean, those people need help and need to be supported not only by the neighboring countries, starting from Poland, Lithuania, or Latvia, but also Germany, France, and the countries of the south who can afford it and who should give the positive answer to those. And the diplomatic restrictions. Of course, you know that the Polish ambassador was actually forced to leave the country. There was, and let me contradict my colleague, there was a positive answer from many European countries. Many ambassadors, EU ambassadors, were also recalled for consultations as an act of solidarity with Poland and Lithuania. Of course, we believe that we need to keep the diplomatic channels open. That's why we are not against giving having an ambassador in Minsk. We also truly believe that our ambassador, Polish ambassador, should be in Minsk, because we need to keep the channels open. It's unfortunately the decision of Minsk or Moscow probably not to have diplomats, Polish, Lithuanian in Minsk, because Moscow is interested in the isolation of Belarus. I mean, to keep it closed, to keep it close to the other partners, but Russia, just to have Russian representatives all around the world and around Europe. So, and we would like to discuss Belarusian issues with the Belarusian people rather than with the Kremlin authorities.
Thank you, colleagues, for such enriching, dynamic, and pragmatic discussion that we had today, and it's so provoking and providing some answers why we are still living in a Europe where there is one backward-looking autocrat next to our doors. So there are both national and EU lessons learned, and I'm glad that we touch upon today. So for the audience, stay tuned in. There will be another episodes of the Riga Security Forum on several topical issues on the agenda. Thank you, colleagues.